From Hamilton Place Strategies in Washington, D.C., this is the HPS Insights podcast.
Welcome to HPS Insights, a regular podcast from Hamilton Place Strategies analyzing the current events impacting the business and political communities. I'm your host today, Michael Steele, a partner here at Hamilton Place. I was Speaker Boehner's spokesman and have worked for 3 Republican presidential campaigns. Today, I'm joined by Stacy Kerr, another partner, who is a senior aide to Speaker Pelosi. We're excited to host Kate Andersen Brower, who's joining us today to discuss her new book, Team of Five, The President's Club in the Age of Trump.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Kate. Thanks for coming, Kate, and welcome. Yeah, we're so excited to talk about this new book, and it's an inside look at the lives of the 5 most recent former presidents following their White House years. Looking at the friendships developed in this very exclusive club, how the former presidents interacted with the politics of the time, the unwritten rules of the club, and how Donald Trump fits or doesn't fit into this group. Welcome, Kate.
Thanks for having me, Stacy and Michael. I'm excited to chat with you.
Yeah, and in addition to Team of 5, Kate, you've written 2 New York Times bestsellers, including your #1 New York Times bestseller, The Residence. You're a former journalist covering the Obama White House for Bloomberg and a former Fox News producer, now a CNN contributor. And that makes you, Kate, our first HPS Insights New York Times bestselling guest.
Oh, I'm very honored. Thank you.
Yeah. So, and I'm excited for this conversation with our resident history buff, Michael Steele. And Steele, who I must point out, received recently, after a TV appearance, a 0 out of 10 from the very important Room Rater. And Kate, on your virtual book tour across different TV networks, just received a 9 out of 10, which is basically gold.
Congratulations. That's spectacular work.
I don't want to rub it in, but it has been the highlight of my virtual book tour.
I did not know that stacking your books horizontally was such a crime against nature, but apparently it's completely disqualifying in terms of home decorating.
Really? They dinged you for that.
They dinged me for color coding and horizontal stacking, among who knows.
I thought Steele should have gotten credit that he's actually probably read all of the books on his shelf.
Yeah. Yeah.
But we should talk about this, the latest addition to my subpar background here, and this exciting book that you've written.
Kate, your book is incredibly well sourced from both former presidents and first ladies and their staff, and also from the many people who surrounded them. And it includes you're sitting down with Donald Trump for the book. So, Kate, tell us a little bit more about the book.
Well, I came up with the idea to write it because I'd written a book called The Residence about the butlers and the maids at the White House. And a lot of the reaction I got to that book was people were shocked about Inauguration Day and the kind of the controlled chaos that goes on in the White House when they're moving one family in and another out. And it's actually the staff, the resident staff, who does that. So it's incredible. And then during Donald Trump's inauguration, that image of President Obama and Michelle Obama taking off in the helicopter on their way to Andrews was such an incredible moment, I thought. And, it just made me think, what happens when you go from being the most powerful person in the world to, as being a semi-private citizen. I don't think they're ever really private citizens again. So I wanted to explore that. And then, of course, there's a book called The President's Club, which I loved. But I wanted to look at it in the more modern context of Donald Trump and how he's changed the club and maybe even unified the former presidents. It's funny because I talked to an Obama aide who said, it was the beginning of my research a couple of years ago, and he said, this would be a great novel. Like, if it would be wonderful if they're all just like on some text chain and they're like, can you believe this guy? And what are we going to, but it's a little more nuanced than, so I go into that in the book and how their relationships are kind of complicated. They're not all aligned all the time. And it's just fascinating to me, each of these characters is so interesting. And Donald Trump is like endlessly fascinating, right?
Can you talk a little bit about Jimmy Carter and his role in the club and how it's changed in the age of Trump? I just remember him being kind of the odd man out in previous discussions of this sort.
Absolutely. I mean, I went down to Plains, Georgia, this tiny town where the Carters live. And when I say tiny, I mean less than 1,000, less than 100,000 people live there. It's just a very sweet little town. They have lived there since he lost the election. And he's somebody who, I think Donald Trump actually feels an affinity for, because he's also an outsider in the club. The photo on my book cover is of the 5 living presidents at the time. And I had to struggle to get this photo because most of the shots from that day, Jimmy Carter is standing off awkwardly to the side. If you've seen them.
Oh, really?
So bizarre. Yeah. They just do not, they don't care for the fact that Carter's always weighing in on their policies. Carter always wants to be in on the action. He even wanted Donald Trump to send him to North Korea as of a couple years ago, so he could broker.
Which that would have been interesting.
Yes. He does not stop. I think he's slowing down now, but he's constantly dragging Rosalind Carter around with him everywhere, and she's exhausted by the whole thing. I love Rosalind Carter because she just kind of tells it like it is, because when I interviewed them, they have this very modest ranch house, and they cook for themselves. I mean, it's amazing. They're very down to earth. And I asked him what he thought of Donald Trump, and he said, well, he lies, but Ronald Reagan lied too. So, and Rosalind Carter says, Jimmy, this is a train wreck, this is not the same thing as Ronald Reagan. She kind of tells it like it is, and he's still
a little bitter.
Yeah.
And when was that? When did you sit down with them? When were you in Georgia?
This was 2 years ago. So, Donald Trump was still, a year into the presidency. And so it was a little different because Carter still wanted to be sent to North Korea. So he was still measuring what he was saying. The Carter Center relies on money from the government. He doesn't want to completely, burn bridges with this administration. But since then, he's come out and questioned whether Trump is a legitimate president. And so now they can't stand each other, and that's the story of Donald Trump and these former presidents. It's like a roller coaster. Emotion. Yeah.
And Kate, it's interesting to be having this conversation, I think, with the 3 of us, Steele having worked for Speaker Boehner and my time with Speaker Pelosi. And what I think is interesting about your book is it is the diplomacy in the modern era. And we've all seen that role, the important role that diplomacy has at the highest levels of American politics. And I wonder just what you both think. Is Trump changing, or is just our modern technology and our modern ways of communicating changing, the role of diplomacy? What do you think, Kate?
Well, so Michael's question was what Carter's done to anger all these presidents. And I didn't actually get to it in that he when Clinton was president, he went to Haiti and North Korea, and he brought a CNN crew along with him on these trips, and really angered Clinton because he did an interview with CNN before he even briefed the president. So that's kind of you're not, as supposed to do that. And they had a real screaming match in the Oval Office about it. So I think it's changed that, now you can't rely, Trump isn't relying on anyone for help. And I'd be curious what Michael thinks of that, because I don't know if I know George W. Bush would help, and I've been told he would love to help during this pandemic, but there's no way that that Trump could make any phone calls now. And the irony, I think, is that Trump does feel more comfortable talking to Vladimir Putin than he does talking to George W. Bush, which is very bizarre, right? Things have changed.
Yeah, I can't think of another American president who has come to the Oval Office with not just contempt for his predecessors in the other party, which I think is relatively rare, particularly after they kind of get to know the job, but just such blatant contempt for the previous presidents of his own political party. And part of that is obviously that the president isn't traditionally speaking, or in his own personal history, a Republican, and represented really a break from the tradition of the Bush family and Reagan before them. But I think it's sad, both on the level of the commander-in-chief himself, that he doesn't get the counsel of the folks who have done this job before. And it also makes it harder, I think, to staff the administration. If they don't like to hire people who worked for President Bush, well, to find experienced Republican staff, you've got to go back pretty far to find folks who didn't work for a president named Bush.
That's a really good point, because I have a chapter on the transition in this book, and I talked to, he worked for Chris Christie, and he was one of the people who was in charge of the transition. And he said just that. He said, the Trump folks would say, we don't want anyone who worked for Bush. And they're like, well, then we can bring a 90-year-old who used to work for Ronald Reagan. Like, what do you?
Right. I mean, running the executive branch of the federal government of the United States is an enormously complex task, and you want people who have experience at a more junior level to go into a new administration at a more senior level, and that I think has been very difficult for them, in part because of the current president's relationship with his predecessors.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Kate, you sat down in the Oval Office with Trump, right, for the book. He agreed to an interview. Mm-hmm. So is this intentional by him? Obviously, it's very in character to the Trump we now have come to know, but what was that like?
I mean, it was surreal, because the last time I had been there was years ago during Barack Obama's first term. And it was strange going back and seeing these characters like Kellyanne Conway, right? And people who it's just the difference and how stark it is surprising. I think the interview was, it was easier to get than any other interview, probably that I've ever, including written responses that I've had from George H.W. Bush years ago, which took months to even get the written responses. This interview with Donald Trump was, probably a couple weeks in the making, and it was just a few emails to get the interview. And I think that that's because he really wanted to talk about the subjects, because he wants to prove that he's better than all of them. And in fact, I have this, I forgot, this is funny. So he, during the interview, brought this piece of paper that says Trump administration accomplishments on it. And you can't see them, but he brought it in. He had his assistant at the time bring it in. And, he's got over 5.3 million jobs created. I mean, it's just this single space list of things he said he's accomplished. And you guys know, any sitting president, Barack Obama is not going to give a journalist a list of his accomplishments, because it kind of goes without saying, and he's not going to be defensive about it. It was so surprising. And a couple of times during the interview, he asked me what the book was about, which also surprised me, because I was pretty clear in the questions I was asking. But he's like, you write about first ladies, right? Like, do you want to talk about first ladies? And I was like, no. We were talking, he was kind of a bit all over the place, but, it was surreal. And I asked him if he has more empathy for the men who came before him. And he said, absolutely not. And then he went through all the things that he thinks they had done wrong. And then he did say that he could see becoming friends with Bill Clinton again, which can you guys ever imagine that happening?
No, of course not.
No. Well, and I think what we're seeing now, right, this was all pre-corona. And I think you said this, Kate, you wrote an op-ed in the New York Times recently, and you said Trump stripped the former presidents of their unique ability to unify the country in a crisis. And, I think that's interesting. Now we've heard from President Obama and President Bush in recent weeks now during this crisis. So what did you sort of make of all of that, of the president's comments and sort of Trump's positioning on that?
Well, I don't know. You guys might know Angel or Urena, who works for Clinton, but I've always, he responded to me like in lightning speed when I was working on that op-ed. And I didn't even tell him that was what I was working on. I just said, this was in mid-March, just when the schools were closing. And I just emailed and said, has Trump called Clinton? I just want to make sure he hasn't. And he said, no, absolutely not, and then he was just lightning quick on email, which he normally isn't. And I think it's because they want to make the point, he's not reaching out to us, we are ready to help in any way we can. And I think the real frustration, and you guys know this being political aides, is that their hands are tied. And like people around Obama say that he would love to help, but if he does, it'll become a story about, the former presidents versus Trump and why are they doing this without him? So they are very frustrated. And I think that's why we see Bush's video, which did not mention. Like, what did you?
He kind of found a very authentic and almost a really necessary and beautiful and comforting way to do that without criticizing Trump, which would have been out of character for President Bush also.
Right.
Absolutely. And I thought it was a great video, but what did you guys make as people who've been in politics for so long? Just the fact that Trump would take it as a direct criticism and would tweet, within hours. Why would you do that? Like, what's the strategy behind that? Instead of saying, thank you, President Bush, let's all get together and, fight this.
I don't think there is a strategy. I think one of the most frustrating things about the president is that every time he's presented with an opportunity to rise above and provide empathy or unity to the nation, he goes the other way. And that's deeper than strategy. That's his personality. That's something at the core of his person that is clearly not going to change after so many examples.
Yeah, it's like the strategy is character above all, and he's revealed sort of that he's maybe doesn't have the capabilities and the capacities for empathy, like you say. And I think that from the people that we've worked for, what's so interesting is oftentimes people don't see this, but I think people like Speaker Boehner and the former presidents and Speaker Pelosi, they're institutionalists. They love the institution. I can say for a fact that Speaker Pelosi loves the institution of the Congress and its role in our governance structure more than her own role in it. And it's easy to characterize these people, but I do believe that they are that they believe in the institutions, and Donald Trump is just sort of upending that.
Yeah, I love that because there's this great, I love Harry Truman, and there's a great quote that he has, which is something, I'm paraphrasing it, but it's like, you have to remember when you're president that the honors and the 21 gun salutes and all that, it's not about you. It's, and that's the quote. And what he means is obviously exactly what you're saying. It's about the institution. So when you hear Hail to the Chief or any of those songs, I think Trump believes that it's about him,
yes,
and not something bigger than him, right?
Yes.
That's not good. Very bad.
Funny you mentioned Truman. I was trying to think about when the tradition of former presidents not criticizing current presidents began. Because, we've had presidents who've run twice. Teddy Roosevelt ran against his own successor. It feels, Roosevelt was obviously died in office. It feels to me like and there was the beautiful example of John Adams and Thomas Jefferson rekindling their friendship after the fierce partisanship of their presidencies. But it feels like a post-World War II institution, right? This is basically Truman deciding not to criticize Eisenhower that started this precedent, or is there something deeper or a longer history of that?
No, I really do start it mostly with Eisenhower and Kennedy, and the fact that during the Bay of Pigs here, Eisenhower had set up this military operation right before Kennedy was even in office.
Yeah. Then
this disaster happens, and instead of Kennedy doing what Donald Trump would surely do, which would be like, hey, this wasn't, it's just on my watch. I didn't come up with this plan. He actually, goes to Eisenhower and says, they have this private meeting where they talk about it, and Eisenhower chastises him for it, even though it was Eisenhower's idea. And Kennedy was so shrewd that he knew, it would make no sense to come out and publicly criticize Eisenhower, who people revered and just adored. So I think that that's really when I see it coming into full force, in our modern times. But yeah, I look back at the Adams and Jefferson relationship and Teddy Roosevelt running against Taft, his handpicked successor. It's an amazing story.
Right?
Yeah, they said terrible things about each other, right?
Absolutely.
It's never been easy.
Well, that's probably a good time to take a quick break and hear from our sponsors, and we'll be back in just a minute.
You're listening to HPS Insights, a regular podcast from Hamilton Place Strategies. Be sure to subscribe to hear the latest from the HPS team on policy debates affecting the business and political communities.
We're back at HPS Insights with New York Times bestselling author Kate Brower. So Kate, we've been talking a lot about the former presidents and their relationship with Trump and what Trump is sort of bringing to this president's club. But I think, one of the really interesting things about this book is all the stories that you share about the relationship between the former presidents before Trump. And I wonder, can you just share a couple of your favorites?
Absolutely. And I think that that's what the book is really trying to do, is to remind us of a time when there was a relative collegiality between these men, and also between first ladies, because I have a chapter about first ladies in the book, and I have a story about Melania Trump and Laura Bush, and how Laura Bush is really the only former first lady who Melania has any relationship with. So I think my absolute favorite story is the story of Barack Obama. 3 days before George H.W. Bush passed away, Obama went to Houston for an event at the Baker Institute. And this had been a meeting that had been coordinated for months, because you know that it takes a long time for these things to happen. Sure. And Bush was not having a good day. I interviewed his chief of staff, Jean Becker, who's like a member of the Bush family. And she said, if it was anybody else, she said when Obama walked into their house, she turned to him and whispered, if it was anybody else but you, I would have canceled this. This is not a good day for him. Obviously, he passed away 3 days later. He was really not doing well, but he was looking forward to seeing Obama. The two of them had a great relationship. Obama called him my buddy 41. When he celebrated Bush at the White House for his Points of Light charity work, he said, that the dignity and just the incredible, elegant leadership of Bush, I think, it inspired him. I mean, he was a World War II hero. And I think their relationship was very genuine. I mean, there was a lot of respect there. Obama especially respected Bush for his foreign policy chops. And so he went to Houston, and they sat alone for more than an hour. Well, they were with John Meacham and with Neil Bush. And George H.W. Bush was in a wheelchair, couldn't speak much at the time, and just kind of was sitting there listening to all of them talking. And then at the very end of this conversation, that was about 45 minutes long, Obama asked if everyone else could leave the room so he could speak to Bush alone. And who knows what they said. Wow. But it's very moving to think that the last former president to see Bush alive wasn't his son, George W. It was this Democrat, different race, different generation, political party, everything. But yet they meant a lot to each other. And Neil Bush told me, one of the Bush's sons, that, on his own personal office, he has, 3 photos of Barack Obama. I mean, and Obama would call his dad in the ICU to check in on him. So things like that, I think, are really important to remember that can happen. And I asked Bush, I asked his spokesman, well, why didn't he see, his dad last? Why was it Obama? And the spokesman said he had said goodbye to his dad so many times before. He had been sick for so long that's why. Yeah.
So there's it's interesting, because we see so much of, and we've been talking about how the former presidents play a role in the public life, but they do have these really private, behind the scenes relationships in which they're relying on each other in ways that we don't see in the public. And that sounds like a great sort of example of that.
No, absolutely. And even these, and we were talking earlier about these very difficult rivalries between Teddy Roosevelt and Taft and all that. But, you see that in modern times. Jimmy Carter attacking George W. Bush for his mishandling of Hurricane Katrina. At Coretta Scott King's funeral in 2006, Carter said, at the funeral, he said, the struggle for equality is not over. And, he was clearly talking about, because that was right as Hurricane Katrina was going on, the treatment of African Americans in this country. And he apologized privately to Bush at his presidential library opening, at Bush's library opening. And Bush said, oh, hush, it's fine. This is what happened. Yeah. And I actually think another story that I love, which is really quick, is that, and this is out there publicly, but I think it's really important to remember, is that after bin Laden was killed, the first person, after everyone was safe, Obama's first call was to George W. Bush.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I have reporting in the book that hasn't been out there. It's a smaller story and it's quick, but it's that before Obama went to West Point to talk about drawing down troops in Iraq, he also called Bush on the helicopter to say what he was about to do.
Yeah.
Because it's just like out of respect.
Respect. Right.
And that's the biggest thing, the biggest difference I feel like in this, I don't want to take it back to Trump, but I'm taking it back to Trump, that it's the lack of respect and empathy for the people who held the office before and the decisions they made, often with incomplete information. And it's a lack of respect that is really a sharp contrast, it seems, from his predecessors.
Yeah. Before we close, I want to know actually from both of you, because Kate, I think you raised a really, a really important question. In this era, can former presidents be private citizens? Like, do they have a responsibility to chime into the politics of our time, or can they truly become, private citizens?
I think they can never become private citizens again. And I think it's just the way it's, unfortunate for their families that that's the case. But I think you're always going to be in the public eye. And there's a lot of frustration among Democrats, as you know, Stacy, that the Obamas haven't come out more. And I've been told that he feels that pressure, and it's pretty obvious that he feels that pressure, that he's not, he knows he needs to do more, but it's like he doesn't want to be this punching bag for Trump because that just gets Trump's base ginned up. So he doesn't respond a lot. And that's another thing. Like, I think that the pressure on Obama is unlike the pressure on any former president, because it's not, the sitting president is dismantling everything he did, which happens, but he's also, personally attacking him at the same time. So I don't think that we are ever going to go back to like a Harry Truman, walking around Independence, Missouri,
right.
Again, where people can just walk up to them and have a conversation.
Right.
Well, but I think you touched on this earlier. It would be great to get back to a place where former presidents can act in that unifying, charitable, making a massive contribution. And in recent history, it's mostly been a contribution abroad. But given what's going on in our country right now, the needs of so many Americans, it would be, I think, it would be a wonderful thing to see the former presidents come together to help Americans struggling in the face of this terrible pandemic.
Oh, absolutely.
If only the president would allow it.
Yeah, people are like desperate for leadership, and right?
Yeah, people want to see that kind of moral authority that only they have, that only they can exert. Because if you're a Democrat or a Republican, it doesn't matter. There's something very unifying about seeing them. And, I think it makes sense for George W. Bush, and Michael, you would know more about this probably, but the sense I have is that they also don't like to weigh in, because when they stay on the sidelines, their approval ratings go way up. Bush left and terrible approval. I mean, absence makes the heart grow fonder, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it has less to do with his personal approval ratings at the moment, and more to do with showing an example of respect for the office, no matter who's occupying it. But you're right that it definitely staying out of the fray is advantageous in some ways.
Yeah.
Well, Kate, you tell stories in this book, and like you said, sometimes I didn't know if I was reading a novel or history, and that's what I think makes it really your unique contribution to the politics and the landscape. And I just love, Kate, that you're bringing a woman's voice as an expert on the role of former presidents, and the role that diplomacy and these families have brought. I think it's so necessary for today's politics. But I really hope that it will be a lasting contribution to the way that we look at history. And as a woman of our generation covering this, I think I think it's really important. It's different, and I hope it will continue. So congratulations on the book. Thank you so much for joining us on HPS Insights.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Stacy.
Thank you for listening to the HPS Insights podcast, produced by Hamilton Place Strategies. For the latest updates, follow us on Twitter at HPS Insight and visit us on the web at hamiltonplacestrategies.com.